All right, day 518 of going live. Today, what we're going to be talking about is real estate contracts as it pertains to real estate agents, very simple transactions. And my goal today is trying to explain real estate contracts, especially if you're entering a relationship with a real estate agent for buy-sell transactions. And what do they mean? Again, I'm not an attorney. It's not legal advice, not investment advice. I'm just simply trying to look for ways or analogies to try to explain this stuff in a simple way, because I've been interviewing people on the Affordable Housing podcast for 3 years almost. And I wish at some point someone just sat me down and just tried to explain these concepts without all the jargon. So I know there's some terminology that we got to use, but hey, let's just have some fun with it. All right. So today, talk about real estate contracts and a couple of sections that I probably want to do. Let's look at my notes right here. I want to cover the types of real estate contracts, what the agency relationships are and those contracts, right? What makes a real estate contract enforceable? What if someone backs out from a contract? Like, how can you back out? And just talk a little bit about what's legal, not legal, from what I know. Again, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a law enforcer. So just bear with me, because I'm just trying to figure out a simple way to explain that to my daughter. And if you have analogies that you think will be good to use, like especially when explaining to like a 10-year-old, that'd be so cool. Leave a comment down below. All right, so today, let's go ahead and talk about just real estate contracts, right? And why do you need contracts, right? And these are really crucial documents that, whether you're a buyer or a seller, or, how do you contract, even regardless of whether you're an investor, right? Either a buyer or a seller, sometimes they can be both investors. And I want to talk about the different contract types. So let's get right in it. So a contract, let's see, what's the best analogy? Like, imagine like two friends are agreeing to swap their favorite video games, right? They had a really good game, but they each only got one for Christmas. So they write down the rules and say, hey, I'm trading with this game and you're trading this game. And they sign it. And in essence, it's kind of just what a trade is. You agree on a value, you agree on something, and you trade it. And in real estate, the stakes are pretty big, right? It's a pretty big home, lots of value being exchanged there. That's why you got to put it in writing. The contract is there to spell out and clearly articulate who's doing what, how much being paid, and what happens if someone changes their mind. So let's get into the types of real estate contracts. What are different types? Well, if you're looking to just buy a single family home, and I assume my daughter's going to buy one someday, well, there's a listing agreement. And this is almost, I would describe as a job description for the agent who's selling a home, right? It talks about the price, how long the seller will be represented by the agent, and what the fee structure looks like. And why this matters, because it grants that agent permission to go out there in a market and market the property and negotiate on the seller's behalf. Then there is a buyer representation agreement. And this is typically a contract between a buyer and an agent who's representing the buyer. And it outlines that the agent is going to help find a property and negotiate the terms in the buyer's favor, right? They're advocating. We talked about agency relationships just yesterday. This is putting it into agreement. And this essentially is so important because it cements that loyalty, right? The duty that agent is going to respect the confidential information that the buyer might disclose to them. And they have to act in the best interest of the buyer. Then there's the third item, it's called a purchase agreement. And often this is called like a sales contract, but it spells out, hey, what's the property address? What's the purchase price? The closing date? And any other condition that might be met, which is some of the contingencies that we talked about, right? The inspection contingency yesterday, the financing contingency yesterday. And it's a good analogy. I mean, think of it as sort of like a roadmap to closing, right? If everything goes right according to the paper, well, you follow that path, you follow that roadmap until the property changes hands, right? Someone pays the other person and the seller hands over the keys or in the title to that property. Then in contracts, there's also the option contract. Okay, this gives one party the right? I have the option to buy or lease a property at a set price within a certain time, and you don't have the obligation to go through with the purchase. You have the option to. Okay, that's why they call it an option contract. And maybe you want to see in development, we see this, right? Maybe you see a piece of land that you might want to develop later, get it approved, build an apartment building on it. And you might pay a small sum in the beginning to lock it down, right? You're paying for that option without having to buy the entire piece of land, which could be a much bigger investment before you do your due diligence and figure out what can you actually build there after looking at environmental studies, the zoning ordinances, whether or not you have to get a rezone. Right? There's so many implications before you enter into an option contract. Then there is a lease agreement. A lease agreement is just typically a document that is between the landlord and the tenant that details and covers what the rent is, the duration is, and the house rules. So what's a good one? I mean, let's say you are staying at your friend's treehouse for a specific amount of time. I mean, you have rules, right? Don't jump off the top of the treehouse, right? Don't do this, don't do that. Don't be so loud because you're going to wake up the neighbors. There's do's and don'ts. You want to lay that out. Exactly. Then finally, there's a land contract. Sometimes this is called a contract for deed. And this is one of the seller financing approaches where the buyer is going to pay over time, but a seller is going to hold the ownership papers until the buyer completes the payment. Very similar to if you were to have a car, right? You have an IOU to the bank holds on to the title of your car, and you don't get it until you finish those payments. All right. Then let's talk about agency relationships and contracts, right? Let's connect that. So typically when a listing agreement is signed, that forms what we call is a single agency for the seller. Similar thing for the buyer, right? Buyer representation agreement signed, a single agency for the buyer. Single agency just means that one agent represents one side, either the buyer or the seller, and it's pretty straightforward. You are loyal and you owe that confidentiality to that one party. Yesterday we talked about dual agency. We just want to hit on this really fast. This is where you have one agent or maybe a brokerage that represents both sides in the same transaction. It's allowed, but everybody needs to agree to this because it can be tricky. There might be conflicts of interest if you don't disclose certain items, right? You can't disclose what the seller's lowest price is. You can't disclose what the buyer's maximum price is. And that can be tricky, especially when you're negotiating and you know those details. Okay. All right. So now there's the relationship called sub-agency, and that was just when another agent helps the listing agent, but still ultimately works for the seller, right? This was probably more common in the past. You don't hear about it that often. That was back then when they were looking for buyers for the seller, right? Then there is a transaction broker. The transaction broker is typically pretty neutral. Sometimes they're just facilitating the deal. Might be a transaction coordinator, but they don't take sides, right? It's like a mediator. But they're not a champion for or advocate for any one party. So what's allowed? We talk about single agency, dual agency, and transaction brokerage. It's allowed. But what's not allowed is if you are in a dual agency relationship and you don't disclose it. You have to inform your clients about those conflicts of interest. If you ignore those confidentialities, I mean, that's some serious problem. And honestly, it's not ethical. Okay. So let's keep going. What makes a real estate contract enforceable, right? Well, there's a couple elements. The most important one is that there is an offer where one side makes a proposal, and there's acceptance where the other side says yes, right? If you ever have a counter offer, that negates the first offer, okay? You can't counter offer and say, hey, I'm gonna go back and accept the old offer. Once you countered, the original offer is off the table, okay? Now, then there needs to be capable parties, right? Everyone signing is an adult of sound mind. You can't be a 6-year-old signing a contract that's not legal. There needs to be a legal purpose to the contract, right? You can't make a contract and ask someone to do something that's unlawful. Doesn't make any sense. That's not going to hold up. Then there needs to be consideration. There's something of value, whether it's money, a promise, or service, has to be exchanged. That's very, very important as another element to what makes a contract enforced. All right, so those are the 4 things. Let's talk about what was the most searched question. What if someone backs out? That's a good one. Okay. So typically when you make an offer on a property, we cover this a lot during our underwriting scenarios, there's a contingency, right? Sometimes you might put a contingency saying like, hey, this offer is based on an inspection contingency, so I can look at the house. If there's something about the condition of the home that I don't like, or maybe it's a material defect, then I can walk away, right? You're reserving that right to walk away. Similar for financing. If you cannot get a loan to buy the property, obviously you cannot buy the house. So you can back out of that. Breach. So if there's no good reason, I mean, one side might claim the contract was broken and they can seek damages or specific performance, which means specific performance is when a court essentially orders the other person to do what they said they were going to do in a contract. Then there's mutual release, right? This is just both parties agreeing to end the deal and move on. Let's keep going for what's legal and not legal. This was the other top question. I think we talked about the forms of agency, but what's most important is you got to know what's permissible and what's not. So what's permissible is obviously single agency with a listing or buy agreement. There is a dual agency. So if both sides sign a disclosure acknowledging that they share the same representative, you can move forward with that agent. And that depends on why you want to do that, but maybe you both trust that agent a lot to be fair in the process. Up to you. That's personal preference. But what's not permissible, and I can't hammer this enough, is that you cannot be an agent and represent both the buyer and the seller behind the backs. You can't do that. You cannot have an undisclosed dual agency, bro. You cannot tell the buyer how low the sellers want to go if you represent the seller exclusively. You can't do that. That breaks loyalty and it breaks confidentiality. You're undermining your seller because you're supposed to get your seller the best price for the property, right? All right. So why did we go through all this stuff? Why does it all matter? I mean, it's really important. If you're signing a deal to sell or buy a property, you want to know exactly what you're promising and who's watching your back and who's vouching for you, right? Understanding your contract and your agent's role is going to be a big game changer, especially if you have the right person on your side helping you get the best deal, whatever that might mean to you. Everybody's definition of a deal is going to be different. So that was my quick deep dive on contracts. And if you have better ways of explaining what real estate contracts are to a 10-year-old, let me know. If you found this helpful, I mean, just please remember to hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate you all supporting the Affordable Housing and Real Estate Investing podcast. Without people like you, I would never have kept it going for 3 years. So I appreciate all the support. Hope you all spend quality Friday evening with your family and friends today, because that's what I'm going to do now. All right. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. If you want to join our email list, just sign up on affordablehousing.io, not .com.io. And hopefully I'll be back here again tomorrow. And we'll cover another topic tomorrow on day 519. Have a good one, everybody. And again, this was not investment advice. It's not soliciting any investments on this call. It's not financial advice, not insurance advice, not legal advice. Not an attorney, none of those. Have an amazing Friday.